Verdun, February 21st, 1916. At daybreak, a rain of shell fire began to fall on French army lines. For almost 9 hours, the German guns fired more than 1 million shells. This was Trommelfeuer, an artillery barrage, a deluge of fire.
Something like 3,000 shells fell every minute on the French positions. 3,000 shells per minute.
We know the horror of the trenches during that conflict, but there was another military structure that was of great strategic importance during the Great War: the forts. They were defended, lost and retaken, playing a key role in the ebb and flow of the war.
Without the forts, Verdun would have fallen very quickly to the German attack. There's no doubt about that.
Among the most massive structures of their age, the forts of Verdun could withstand large caliber shells and were equipped with highly sophisticated armored turrets.
A
75mm field gun was so accurate that you could carve out a bust of a famous character on the mountainside opposite.
Around 40 forts defended the town of Verdun. 3 of them were priority objectives for the Germans. And the most prized of these was Douaumont.
It's a key part of the French defensive system, and it's regarded as being impregnable.
The German soldiers who had to lead the attack were terrified.
The nearby Fort Vaux was under the command of a die-hard general whose motto was, "Buried under the ruins rather than surrender." Lastly, Fort Souville was the last hurdle to cross before taking Verdun. It was defended by a young, inexperienced soldier.
He disobeyed orders and went back to that fort because he knew he could only stop the Germans from that fort.
How did these forts, with their ultra-modern architecture, fall so easily into enemy hands?
It was an absolutely incredible turn of events.
How did the French soldiers try to defend these forts at any cost? Who were these men who stayed cowered in these concrete caverns for weeks on end?
They were drinking their own urine for a day, like you do in a lifeboat, cast adrift on the ocean.
But when these mighty defenses were put to the test, would French technology and strategy prove up to the task? This is a little-known chapter in the Battle of Verdun. The story of the forts of Verdun began in the wake of the French defeat by Prussia in 1871. The French army was disorganized, its weaponry obsolete. The country was vulnerable. To dissuade a fresh German attack, France appointed General Serre de Rivière. He would give the territory permanent fortifications along its borders and coastlines. In the northeast, Verdun was the most powerful of these strongholds.
Germany could resume the war, considering that French rearmament was too rapid. Verdun was the last town the Germans left in 1873, and it was feared they wanted to return.
Especially now that Metz had become German, Verdun was now the main place blocking the most direct route between Germany and Paris.
Verdun was less than 40 kilometers from the border. Its rival was effectively the city of Metz, which had already been fortified by the French, but had now become one giant fortress. It was called Moselstellung by the Germans, and was at the time the world's largest fortification. So Verdun's defences were conceived as an attempt to respond to Germany's Moselstellung. It was one stronghold versus another.
From 1875, Verdun was protected by 2 powerful rings of fortifications. The outer ring was defended by 22 forts around a perimeter of 43 kilometers. 6 other forts provided a line of defense closer to the town. There were also 15 smaller structures. In total, 43 forts were built in the space of 35 years. Between each fort, there were 24 combat shelters with command posts and aid stations. There were cavern shelters to protect troops posted in the area, artillery batteries, and underground munition stores. This was all protected by 1,000 guns and some 65,000 men. The aim of these impressive fortifications was not to halt the enemy, but to slow them down to allow the defending forces time to reorganize.
No fort is ever invulnerable. No medieval castle has ever been invulnerable. But the sole purpose of every fort is to impose a delay on the enemy.
The forts also served to shelter soldiers, giving them time to rest before going back to the front. Inside, they were safe from enemy shells. During the conflict, many French soldiers preferred to be posted in these enormous concrete bunkers rather than face the hell of the trenches. Among these forts, one of the most modern and powerful was Fort Douaumont. Located at an altitude of 388 meters, it covered 8 hectares, making it the largest of the forts surrounding Verdun. In the shape of a polygon, it could hold 800 soldiers who could live self-sufficiently for around 2 months. It was also one of the best armed forts in the region.
It was practically impossible for regular troops to take a fort of that strength. There were too many obstacles to overcome.
The first obstacle was a ring of barbed wire more than 1 kilometer long right around the fort.
The barbed wire was there to stop the infantry. A network of barbed wire that is intact can be crossed, but you have to cut the wires one by one. So it's not easy. And if you're doing it around a fort which is defended, there will be the machine gun and rifle fire, so it's not an easy task.
The second obstacle was the moat. 12 meters wide and 8 deep. It was defended by 3 wall casemates, from which revolving cannons and 120mm cannons could fire on invading forces.
The first thing that comes out of the barrel is the thin brass envelope, which becomes, if you like, a giant ninja star which chops people up, followed by lead balls which will knock down even more of the men. If anyone is still standing, the large iron disc which holds the lead balls in place hits them on the head and kills them. So with 1 round you can kill all the soldiers along the ditch.
In terms of artillery, Douaumont was one of the best armed forts. Its key asset was a Galopin turret with a 155mm gun, 3 meters long and weighing nearly 2.5 tons.
If a 155mm shell weighing 43 kilos comes your way, you know about it. With a rate of fire of 3 rounds a minute, the turret could inflict a lot of damage on enemy troops within a range of some 7 kilometers.
With a 40-centimeter thick steel cap that protected the turret from the most powerful shells, the firing chamber could turn through 360 degrees.
If you see an enemy troop assembling to attack the fort a mile or so away, you can direct fire on them, because inside the turret is a panorama, a painting of the entire countryside. So the commander in his little cloche nearby with his binoculars, he can say to the gunners, right, there's a group of Germans by that church steeple, and they know exactly where the church steeple is. They can point the cannon when it's retracted, then when the turret comes up, it'll fire immediately, and then it drops down to hide.
In addition, Douaumont had a so-called casemate de bourge to provide cover towards neighboring forts. This was a sort of bunker in which 16 gunners could fire with 2 75mm guns at a rate of 12 rounds a minute.
They don't fire towards the enemy. They're protected by an enormously thick wall of concrete on the enemy side, and they fire out to the side. They fire into the interval between your own fort and the next fort. So each fort protects its neighbor, protects its neighbor, protects its neighbor. No one can cross the dead ground between them. So that's the casemate de Bourges.
To remain effective, the superstructure had been continually modernized since its construction in 1885, like most of the other forts around Verdun. Its outer carapace was one example. To begin with, the forts were built with stone masonry, but due to advances in artillery, the fortifications had to be adapted.
In the 1880s, new munitions appeared which changed everything. The use of steel in place of cast iron meant shells became longer and their internal capacity increased. So they had to come up with an answer to this problem.
To stand up to these much more destructive enemy shells, the French army decided to cover the forts with a layer of ultra-resistant concrete with a density of 400 kilograms of cement per cubic meter.
They removed the layer of earth that covered the masonry and poured a layer of special concrete to a depth of 1.5 to 2.5 meters, which itself sat on an amortizing layer of sand, and all of this was over the old stonework.
Only certain parts of the forts were reinforced. So during bombardments, the soldiers urgently had to find areas with a red line that would keep them safe.
And where they are protected the best, you will see a red line which runs along the corridors in the inside. And that means that at that point you are à l'épreuve in French. It means that part of the fort is proof against the biggest shells that can be fired against it. When you go out into a little corridor, you might not be so well protected.
The problem was that this gem of fortification located on the highest point in the Verdun region was coveted by the Germans. Douaumont lay on their route to Verdun.
When they launched their offensive on the 21st of February, this fort lay on their line of attack. So conquering Fort Douaumont was essential for them. They simply had to take it.
From Douaumont, you have an almost 360-degree view. What's more, its guns allowed it to fire on practically all the circumference, at least the part from where the enemy would arrive. So from a tactical point of view, Douaumont's position was key.
But the Germans knew that taking this fort would not be easy. During aerial reconnaissance carried out 2 years earlier, they had photographed the structure. The result was unequivocal. Douaumont seemed impregnable.
Before the attack on the 21st of February, it was already known as the sarcophagus, so it was a fort that inspired fear. It represented the pinnacle in French military technology of the time. The German soldiers who would lead the assault were terrified.
They painstakingly prepared their attack from the aerial photos. Each detail counted.
This included studying its firing capacity, what its response would be, the positioning of its artillery pieces, where and how they could fire, and above all, soldier numbers. Were there 200 men, or 150, or maybe 1,000?
February 25th, 1916. 4 days after the start of the Battle of Verdun, the Germans launched the assault on the impregnable fortress. But events did not unfold as they had expected.
When they arrived in front of Fort Douaumont, one can well imagine that the soldiers were thinking, "Oh my God, we have to approach that?" It was February, it was cold, and on top of that, there was the stress of combat.
The first hurdle was crossed, but the surprises weren't over for the Germans.
They advanced, and to their great surprise, they must have been crying out waiting for the first salvo, which never came. So you might say they were slightly dumbstruck to find themselves in front of the fort. In their detachment, the first man who went inside was Sergeant Kunze with his unit of sappers. They went down into the dry moat. They were fearless guys, because although there was no firing, if you descend into the moat, there could be firing from casemates, from the revolving cannon and 120mm guns defending the fort.
Sergeant Kunze, he expected to be fired at from every moment from the embrasures. He went to an embrasure expecting to find the 5-barreled 37mm or 40mm revolving cannon, and it wasn't there.
Unbelievably, this supposedly highly armed fort was in fact an empty shell. In August 1915, 6 months before the start of the Battle of Verdun, France made an incomprehensible strategic choice, one which would turn out to be catastrophic. At the time, General Joffre, head of the French army, decided to launch an offensive in Champagne, so he had all the forts in Verdun disarmed, since they were unused.
We know they now needed heavy artillery. They needed high-angle weapons or howitzers, but they didn't have them, or very few at least. Where could they find them? In the fortifications. So they stripped them out of the fortifications and redeployed these heavy artillery pieces for the campaign.
But the forts were not only disarmed, they were also emptied of their garrisons. All the soldiers posted there were sent to Champagne, where it was thought they were needed more. As a result, the 800 soldiers that were supposed to defend Douaumont had left. But the Germans didn't know this. And on February 25, 1916, when they launched their attack on the fort, they certainly didn't expect to find it empty of soldiers. Only 57 Frenchmen remained there. What's more, they were aging reservists, anything but battle-hardened veterans. They were led by Hippolyte Chenot. A non-commissioned officer, he was at the head of a maintenance crew, and he was 60 years old.
They had units in the forts for maintenance purposes, and this was the case for the men under Chenot, who were carrying out maintenance tasks. In other words, battery caretakers. He was in charge. He had the equivalent rank of a warrant officer, but it was an administrative maintenance post, not a combat one.
Amazingly, on that day in February, Chenot and his men, shut into the fort safe from the enemy shells that had been falling for 4 days, had no idea that at that very moment they were surrounded by Germans.
You have to remember there was a communication blackout. They didn't know what was going on. Shells were falling by the thousands all around them.
The attackers were thus able to stroll into the fort as if they were walking into a cafe, without so much as firing a shot, as the flabbergasted French looked on.
Chenot was stunned. Suddenly there were Germans standing in front of him. He didn't understand. Then it sank in.
Imagine the stupefaction of the French when they saw them arrive, whereas they were totally unaware that there were German units near the fort.
What could around 60 reservists have done faced with several German companies of pioneers or Landwehr? At that point, they could only do one thing: put their hands in the air and let themselves be taken prisoner.
It was a disaster, bringing humiliation on all of France. The most prestigious fortress had been captured without a fight. From that day forward, retaking Douaumont became an obsession for the French army. On the other side, the news was quickly sent by communiqué. Douaumont ist gefallen. Douaumont has fallen. The Germans were jubilant. Victory seemed close.
Taking Douaumont was a huge propaganda victory, and one which called for the next triumph, which was to be the fall of Verdun. Once Douaumont had fallen, Verdun was in reach. Now the town must fall, since they'd announced the fall of the main obstacle on the way to the town. It had become a matter of prestige, a show of strength.
But the Germans still had one obstacle to get around. Another fort stood in their way: Fort Vaux. If they wanted Verdun, they would have to neutralize it. Only 3 kilometers separate Douaumont from Vaux, and yet it would take the Germans 3.5 months to cover this ground.
Covering even 50 meters when you've got 6 machine guns firing on a company becomes impossible. Bullets are flying everywhere. Add to that shells raining down. Any progress is made in tiny steps, from crater to crater. You advance 5 meters. You keep your head down while the machine guns fire. Then you try to advance another 5 meters, 10 or 20 minutes later. That was what combat was like at Verdun.
Once they arrived in front of Fort Vaux in June 1916, there was still work to do for the Germans. They had to face a French force resolved not to give an inch, which meant a week of ferocious combat. This is Fort Vaux. With a high point at 350 meters, it dominates the whole of the east of the plain. Although much smaller than Douaumont, it was nonetheless very well armed before the start of the war in 1914. 2 casemates de Bourges, a turret with 75mm guns, and 3 armored observation posts. These 10-meter wide moats were defended by 3 wall casemates. This fort had become a priority objective for the German advance.
They couldn't make any forward progress until Fort Vaux was taken out. So if the Germans wanted to achieve the objective of taking Verdun, Fort Vaux first had to fall.
This was unthinkable for the French General Staff. Vaux must hold out at any price. But first they had to find a commander who could stand up to the Germans. They sent out a call for volunteers. An officer came forward, Major Reynal, an authoritarian man aged 49 and a fervent patriot. He was still convalescent and walked with a limp after 3 serious injuries that prevented him from fighting on the front line. But this high-risk mission was perfect for him.
I can't wait to get stuck into the enemy. I'm delighted. This is a dream come true.
He felt he'd been injured too soon, twice in quick succession. He still wanted to serve the homeland.
It was a personal choice, a sense of duty, patriotism, call it what you like, but he thought that, as an officer, this was the moment duty called.
A novice in the workings of Fort Artillery, Reynal first spent a spell at La Falouse, just near Verdun, which had been converted to a center for the wounded. There, he learned how to operate a 75mm turret gun, the same as the one in his future fort. The major was an enthusiastic pupil. But what he didn't know was that the turret gun that was supposed to protect Vaux had been blown up 3 months earlier.
Fort Vaux was heavily bombarded during the early days of the battle. On February 26, 1916, it took direct hits from 129 heavy shells, including 420mm shells which weighed 1 ton and were fired by guns with a range of 14 kilometers. The soldiers said when a shell like that came in, it was like a locomotive with all its wagons crashing down on you. The shell would bury itself in the fort and felt like the fort was pushed down into the ground, which was followed by a terrifying explosion.
But Reynal's first concern was how to get to the fort to take over its command. Under a hail of bullets, leaning on his cane and armed only with his revolver, he made his way through the battleground. On May 24, 1916, after 2 hours' walk, he finally arrived at Fort Vaux. But he was utterly crestfallen when he saw the lamentable state of the fort, which he had promised to defend at all costs. Not only was the 75mm turret gun out of action, but the casemates de Bourges has also been disarmed following the notorious decree of 1915. Fort Vaux had practically no defensive elements left.
Any new weapons would have to be brought in under enemy bombardment. The Germans wanted to seize Vaux because they needed it from a tactical point of view. So they constantly bombarded the zone to stop reinforcements arriving and to stop those in the fort being relieved. They smashed anything they could and which might help the French hang on to the fort, so Vaux could not be rearmed.
Reynal and his garrison of 250 men found themselves in a concrete monolith that had become a simple bomb shelter.
He couldn't really weigh up the situation, and he surely didn't know what fate awaited him. But he quickly understood that he'd arrived in a carcass that was taking hits, and which had no capacity to defend itself and to fire at a range to keep the enemy at a distance.
Reynal had to reorganize his defenses by installing machine guns in the embrasures of the casemates de Bourges. They would be less effective than 75mm guns, but the major had no choice. Now they just had to wait. The Germans would no doubt attack the fortress soon. Inside Fort Vaux, life was getting organized. In the barracks, there were sleeping quarters for the troops, latrines separate for the ordinary soldiers and the officers. There were kitchens, Major Reynal's office, the telegraphy post for communication, and the water cistern, which was underground. Self-sufficiency in supplies, 2 weeks. Intended capacity, 280 men. But at that moment, there were some 600 soldiers in the fort. On top of Reynal's 250 men, another 350 troops had arrived.
This overcrowding came from scraps of units who had become lost or separated. Soldiers who had come to take shelter in the fort, who had lost their commanding officer. They had managed to make their way into the fort and weren't in a hurry to leave, because the bombardment outside was absolutely terrible. At least inside the fort, they had some protection.
They didn't expect hundreds of troops to be jammed inside the tiny corridors of this very small fort. The biggest problem, of course, is that do you have enough food? Do you have enough medical supplies? Do you have enough ammunition? And finally, do you have enough water?
Reynal was confident that if they rationed the supplies, they could hold out for several days, even with such a large garrison. The bombardment outside was so terrifying that no one could set foot outside the fort. Inevitably, living conditions inside rapidly deteriorated. Corporal Laurent of the 51st Engineers Company recalled,
"We lived in filth, with a 2-week beard, covered in lice, with the acrid stench of blood coming from the infirmary, where the wounded piled up. We waded through urine in the latrines, the ammonia making the air unbreathable.
As soon as you entered, you were hit by a terrible smell. An odor of sweat, of leather. It smelled of sulfur. It was oozing everywhere. There was an unhealthy dampness. There was no electric lighting, just pale candlelight. If there was an explosion outside, the shock wave would come in by an entrance, and you'd end up in the dark. Sometimes there were cries of fear when a big shell came in, but the most poignant were the cries of help from the injured.
But Reynal's men had worse to come. On the night of June 2nd, 1916, the Germans moved in on Vaux. Soon the French soldiers inside the fort would experience hell on earth. Under cover of darkness, 2 German regiments, the 158th and 53rd, managed to encircle the fort. The French had taken a position above the coffers in the counterscarp, but as soon as they emerged, the Germans were upon them. Using grenades, they forced the French to pull back inside the coffer. The Germans followed them in, driving them back up the dark tunnels into the barracks. The situation on June 2nd was unprecedented. The fort was half in French hands, half in German.
They were in the situation where the fort was divided in two, and in which combat continued. This was equally surprising for the Germans. They'd surrounded them, but they continued to fight. They would have to drive them out.
But Reynal was determined not to be driven out. He had to hold the fort at all costs.
You had a determined leader, leading men who were aware of doing their duty, with the hope of liberating themselves, and they had weapons. All the elements were there to fight on.
5 days of struggle followed in total darkness. In the narrow corridors just 1.5 meters wide and 2 meters high, French and Germans sheltered behind hastily erected barricades made of sandbags. They used explosives to try and advance a few meters along the tunnel.
Imagine an explosion in a confined space like that. Bam! First there's a shock wave, the eardrums ringing. They'd be completely turned inside out. The smoke would come out of everywhere, so they'd have to put on masks. Then they'd have to go into the tunnels in the pitch black. And knowing that facing them, if they hadn't been neutralized, the enemy only has to pull the trigger and fire straight ahead. The bullets ricocheting all over the place.
You have to imagine, beside the darkness, you're fighting men in close quarters. The bodies were piled up. That's what happened at Vaux. It was absolute horror.
The bodies of French soldiers could no longer be placed outside because they were totally surrounded by Germans, like rats caught in a trap.
You could say that the French garrison was walled in, prisoners in a fortress that was a trap closing in on them.
The conditions inside the fort were absolutely abysmal, but still they fought on. That's the amazing thing. They never gave in. They were such brave men.
Major Reynal had succeeded in instilling the same determination into his troops.
He was ordered to apply the motto of the 5th Foot Artillery Regiment, buried under the ruins of the fort rather than surrender. He was very much in that defensive logic. They hung on bitterly to the terrain, and they'd do everything to make sure the fort didn't fall into enemy hands.
It was now June 4th, 1916. The fighting in the tunnels had gone on for 2 days and 2 nights. The situation was critical. But Major Reynal had not given up hope. Then, disaster struck.
A sergeant and the engineers came to see Reynal and told him there was no more water. And Reynal says, "What do you mean there's no more water?" So the sergeant showed him the cistern, which was made of stonework, and because of the bombardments, this had caused vibrations which produced cracks, and the water had leaked away. So there was no more water, and that was a whole different ballgame. On June 4th, this turning point occurred. The countdown had started for the French, and they knew it. They could pull out, or else die in the main attack. Otherwise, they would have to surrender. Because being thirsty drives you crazy.
The siege situation made bringing in provisions impossible. Outside, an avalanche of shells continued to fall on the fort. Major Reynal had to ration water strictly. His men were soon on the brink. Sub-Lieutenant Roy recalled.
We now had to fight an additional adversary, an enemy against which we had no arms, apart from courage and gritting our teeth. It can all be summed up in the rumor that spread among the groups. There was no water left in the cistern.
Some started to pass out, others fell ill, some licked the walls in search of a little moisture.
They were drinking their own urine for a day, like you do in a lifeboat, cast adrift on the ocean. You can do that for a while, but then you can't do it anymore. It's the last desperate measure.
The French would only be saved if the army launched a counter-offensive on the fort to drive out the Germans. Reynal had to warn the general staff of the urgency of the situation, but telephone communications were cut. His last hope was a pigeon. At the time, carrier pigeons took messages to the Army General Staff. The birds could only navigate in one direction, from where they were released to their home pigeon coop. Major Reynal had 4 pigeons to begin with, and 3 had already been released. Only 1 was left, with the registration number 787-14. It was the last hope for those entombed in Fort Vaux. This is the message that Reynal attached to its foot. We are still holding out, but have suffered an attack by gas and fumes, very dangerous. We need to be relieved urgently. This is my last pigeon. The bird was released. It had to get back to its pigeon coop at the citadel of Verdun, about 10 kilometers away, the headquarters of the General Staff. But its flight was strewn with hazards.
It had to fly for kilometers, starting with flying over the battlefield, avoiding the explosions, the gas, the shrapnel. Imagine a bird having to negotiate all that.
But the pigeon fulfilled its mission and Raynal's message was delivered. Unfortunately, the French attempts to counterattack failed. It was impossible to relieve the fort.
Reynal had the hope that perhaps the French army could break through. The garrison from Verdun could break through to save his men and himself and the fortress. But there was no chance of them doing it because the Germans were not only surrounding the fort with troops, but they were bombarding the French lines from which the help should arrive or could arrive. And so the French couldn't get through. And Reynal, well, yes, he would have hoped. It was a forlorn hope. But you take every forlorn hope. You clutch at every straw.
Inside the fort, the situation was dramatic. They had been fighting now for 4 days in the tunnels in the middle of the gas, and the water had run out. Raynal's men were literally dying of thirst.
I did the rounds of our posts. Defeat could be read on all the faces. My words could no longer rouse the soldiers who, a few hours earlier, still had a glimmer of hope in their eyes. The men no longer responded to my entreaties. They looked at me in a daze. They were suffering. The end, the horrible, unavoidable end was approaching. My burning throat was tight with anxiety. No, this must not be so. Help. Help.
Raynal's morale wasn't broken, it was just that he couldn't ask his men to fight day and night without drinking. It wasn't possible. There comes a point when the organism can no longer respond.
After 6 days and 7 nights of fierce fighting, on June 7, 1916, Major Raynal surrendered to the Germans. But in this dark fortress, it was hard to communicate with the enemy.
The French removed a sandbag and held out a pole with a white flag. But at first, the Germans didn't see it. The officer who had been ordered by Raynal to contact the Germans was accompanied by a bugler. So he has the bugler sound the ceasefire.
The French were taken prisoner. Those who surrendered were wounded, terrified ghosts. They had fought to the end. The Germans had been impressed by the resilience and courage of their opponents.
Raynal made it a point of honor to have a well-turned-out French guard of honor. The men were weary, they were thirsty, but they surrendered with honors. They remained dignified despite the fighting, and that impressed Muller. He recorded how he arrived in the central pathway and he was flanked by 2 rows of French soldiers who stood at attention impeccably. Raynal had equipped his soldiers, they had nothing missing, right down to the canteens, which were obviously empty. Muller was impressed at the resilience of these adversaries.
By candlelight, the French left the fort and were taken to a POW camp. But they only had one thing in mind: drinking.
The Germans said that when they came across the French, first in the barracks and when they began to go down into the tunnels, the French did this to the Germans. They described how they pointed their thumbs at their mouths to show they were thirsty. Then the French came out of the fort, finally leaving that hellhole. They descended the slopes of Fort Vaux, and they literally threw themselves in the first water they saw. They drank even if the water wasn't fit for consumption, which meant some later got sick, which isn't surprising, given all the waste and body parts that were in the water.
The Germans moved into their new spoils. Fort Vaux was theirs. Verdun lay just 5 kilometers away. Their goal was in reach. After Douaumont had fallen, then Vaux, one final obstacle lay in their path: Fort Souville. If the Germans could capture it, Verdun would be theirs. If they failed, the French could counterattack and try to retake the forts they had lost. But defending Fort Souville would be no easy task for the French soldiers. The structure was little more than a ruin and was under the command of a man who, on the face of it, did not have the mettle to defend a stronghold. It was July 11th, 1916, 1 month after the fall of Fort Vaux. Under a barrage of fire and steel, the 3rd Company of the 7th Infantry Regiment set off at a rapid pace. Its mission was to join the front at the Vaux Chapitre Quarry, 6 kilometers away, to reinforce the troops. The short journey was terrible for the 200 men of the company.
There were hardly any more trenches left. There were shell holes filled with water and mud in which men could drown. The soldiers had to survive in the cold and mud, with rats. There were bodies everywhere.
On top of that, they had to deal with chemical weapons, including the fearsome phosgene gas, which could kill in seconds. This gas decimated the 3rd Company of the 7th Infantry. Out of 200 men, in barely 2 hours, 140 had been gassed. Among them their leader, Captain Succar, who could no longer command his troops. He handed command to the only officer in a fit state to fight, the runner Kleber Dupuy. At first glance, he did not have the stature of a leader. Only 24, he was just a sub-lieutenant and had no experience of war. Barely 2 years before, this man from the Atlantic resort of Arcachon was a school teacher. But on the morning of July 11, 1916 in Verdun, Dupuy found himself in charge of 60 men, and he had no choice about it. His nephew, Jean-Louis Dupuy, knows Kleber's story well. His uncle's military feats have been passed down from generation to generation.
You know, in that moment, an officer obeys orders. You tell him you're taking over command of the company, you're going to the quarries. That's an order. I'll go to the quarries. I won't ask any questions. I'm only a junior officer. I'm just a sub-lieutenant.
So they headed towards the quarries, as stipulated by the initial order received by the company. But on the way, Dupuy's men passed in front of Fort Souville.
It was when he passed in front of Souville with his 60 men that a sergeant burst out of the fort, a reservist who was part of the garrison in the fort, and who said to him,
Lieutenant, the fort is done for. They're all dead or gassed. Lieutenant Colonel Astruc, who commanded the fort, is dead. You have to do something. Come and see. Kleber Dupuy said to himself, what's going on? I have to go and see.
It was 6 in the morning when Kleber Dupuy went down into the bowels of the fort.
He entered the fort and saw men lying down moaning. Some injured, others dead. He saw that the fort was not in a fit state to be commanded. So he wondered, what do I do? Do I go to the quarries? In line with my orders? But if I do that, what about the fort?
The dilemma for the young teacher was that if he went to the quarries, he risked losing his men because of the bombardments. If he stayed at the fort, he would be disobeying and risk being court-martialed. His decision was taken. He would defend the fortress. And this choice would leave its mark on the Battle of Verdun.
What was going through his mind? He knew very well that his decision could mean a court-martial. He was only young and had no real experience, not like a seasoned officer.
It's a snap judgment. It's the instantaneous situation which makes his mind up. He realizes there's perhaps a better course of action than obeying an order which no longer corresponds to the immediate situation that he sees before him.
Fort Souville is the final line of defense before Verdun, which is just 3,800 meters away. If it falls, Verdun falls. Kleber Dupuy understood that. The problem was that the fort was no longer in a defensible state. Because of the decree of 1915 on disarming the forts, the casemate guns had gone. The 90mm guns and 2 smooth-bore mortars had also disappeared. Dupuy could not count on the 2 155mm guns in the retractable turret. One of the 2 barrels had blown up, putting it out of service. So on July 11, 1916, when Dupuy decided to take command of Souville, the fort was totally disarmed and in ruins. The former teacher had to urgently reorganize the fort's defenses.
He was a good tactician. With the few men he had, he tried to optimize his resources. He spurred on the reservists so that even those who couldn't fight could supply the soldiers fighting on the front line with grenades. He tried to position the 3 machine guns as best he could. He had to make the right decisions, and he had to make them under the bombardments. Doing that requires an incredibly cool head, and that's exactly what Kleber Dupuy had.
Dupuy had always had a passion for rugby, which is a strategic team sport played as a collective, the aim of which is to conquer the opposition terrain. In Verdun, Dupuy found himself team captain.
He was a winger, and when you give a winger the ball, he doesn't have any choice. He has to go forward. And just like in rugby, in the battlefield, he knew how to position his men, instinctively putting them in the right place.
The day drew to a close. The German attack was imminent. Kleber Dupuy and his men were ready.
All that was left to do was wait. And wait. And wait. The 60 surviving men in the company could get some rest. Some wrote letters, others wrote their will, because they knew very well they might never get out of there alive.
The next day, on July 12th at 5:30 in the morning, the Germans attacked from the north. The battle lasted 3 hours, with 1 Frenchman for every 5 Germans.
They were 10 meters apart. This was a battle with guns, but then it continued with bayonets and daggers, especially because the Germans had infiltrated the defending ranks. So the battle for Souville was hand-to-hand stuff. 3 hours is an incredibly long time, when there's only 35 of you with just 3 machine guns, and the waves of Germans keep coming, and you don't know how many waves of Germans will come.
By good fortune, around 9 a.m., French reinforcements arrived shore up the western end of the fort. The enemy had overrun the superstructure of the building. They had to be neutralized and dislodged. But the French chief of staff made a grave mistake. Seeing Germans on top of the fort through binoculars, they thought Souville was in the hands of the enemy and ordered it to be bombarded.
The French artillery began to shell Fort Souville to halt the German advance. And these shells were killing the French soldiers who were fighting against the Germans.
Furious, Dupuy dashed to the telephone and pleaded with the chief of staff to fire farther away.
Hello? Hello? Turret command post. Fire further on. Where are you? In Souville. What about the Germans? The Germans have been driven back. We took some prisoners. Fire further on.
The French soldiers had succeeded in halting the enemy, forcing them to seek cover in shell holes. At around 2 p.m. on July 12th, the attackers were definitively pushed back. Only 15 men remained in Kleber Dupuy's company out of the initial 60. But Fort Souville remained French. Verdun did not fall. The Germans did not pass.
One side was determined to capture the fort, but the others were determined to defend it. In the end, it was those who were the most determined who won the battle.
The Battle of Verdun could have ended there, but the French wanted a crushing revenge. They had to retake the forts, especially Douaumont, shamefully lost 8 months earlier. No matter the cost in human lives.
It does become an object of prestige, of pride. If you've lost the fort so carelessly, then you want to win it back. So capturing Douaumont then becomes that, if you like, the key to that drive to demonstrate we haven't lost this battle.
If one thinks that Verdun represents France, reconquering part of the ground lost in February or May meant reconquering part of France.
The French army threw everything into it. They brought in 2 genuine monsters, 400mm howitzers mounted on rails positioned 14 kilometers from their target. On October 24, 1916, after some 3,500 large-caliber shells had been fired on the fort, Douaumont was back in French hands. The country's honor was safe, but the operation had cost the lives of thousands more men. 9 days later, Fort Vaux was liberated. It had come full circle. The great battle concluded with a return to the starting point between the enemy armies, except they had by now lost some 700,000 men, either dead or wounded. The Battle of Verdun lasted 10 months, but it would be another 2 years before the war was over. During those 2 years, Major Reynal, the courageous defender of Fort Vaux, remained a prisoner. After the war, his last carrier pigeon, called the Vaillant, would be proclaimed a hero in the eyes of the nation, receiving a Ring of Honor. Back in civilian life, Kleber Dupuy, the young teacher who had held off the Germans 3 kilometers from Verdun, spent the rest of his days taking care of war veterans. He refused all honors till his dying day.
When people said he was a hero, he replied, "Me, a hero? I was just one among many."
As for the forts of Verdun, the experience gained during the fighting was used to design the future Maginot Line, the fortified defense system built in France from 1928 to counter the German threat. In Verdun, 100 years later, the vestiges of some of these forts are still visible, some even open to the public. They bear silent testimony to one of the most fearsome battles of the Great War.